This is going to be a controversial take among those who happen to be to the right of me, no matter how I frame it, but I will certainly try my best. On the so-called dissident right, there is an established cultural practice. Either you do not mention the Jews at all, or you mention them in a negative light. I would say a new perspective is needed, the one which will align closer to the truth. In this video, I, Ubersoy, and Will Viver, who I am collaborating with, will argue against the notion that Jews are not really that smart and supposedly got their power through nepotism, in response to Leather Apron Club, who has been getting a lot of attention lately. Now, I know, some of you might already started cringing, but wait until you hear the arguments. I should also say that in no way do we claim that Jews deserve to enjoy the disproportionate influence that they do. We simply are saying that it just so happens to be this way when the markets, as they say, are free. In fact, at the end of this video, I will talk about how increasingly, because of the free markets and liberalism, they are losing that influence. So it's not a permanent condition that you're stuck with until forever. Now, if you believe in JQ stuff purely because you think it makes sense, not because of some deeper motivation, then this video is for you. I will list all of our sources in the description below that you can check out for yourself. Above all, I hope for an open discussion on this subject with different points of view, and for one, I'm willing to participate and defend my own perspective in a debate. That is to say, I challenge any JQer with a big following for a discussion, because I believe that all ideas should be able to be freely expressed. Free speech works both ways, and if somebody wants to argue the JQ or even argue against it in an open society, they should be able to. Anyways, enjoy the video.
So not too long ago, Leather Apron Club, henceforth LAC, released a video entitled "Nobody Knows That Half of Joe Rogan's Guests Have This in Common." The video attempts to demonstrate that between 18 and 20% of Joe Rogan Experience guests are Jewish, including an eyebrow-raising 41.61% of specifically political guests. The point of this was to portray a massive overrepresentation of Jewish guests and to explain it all away as the result of Jewish collusion and foul play, to use his words, rather than the typically given explanation of disproportionate competency and merit. And back then I responded with a video of my own actually demonstrating some exaggerations on his part, as well as seriously questioning the implications of his findings. Well, he's recently uploaded something of a part 2. In this video, LAC tries to dismiss all of the merit-based explanations for Jewish overrepresentation by, quote, debunking the high Jewish IQ. And in doing so, he assumes that IQ alone is the alternative explanation for Jewish overrepresentation, and so if he's able to debunk it, the only one left is what's known as ethnic nepotism, whereby Jews are just displaying an overwhelming bias to hire, promote, and network near exclusively with each other, so as to dominate institutions without actually being any more competent than the average white Gentile. Ubersoy and I will show how LAC doesn't actually challenge the consensus on Ashkenazi intelligence, but first let's start with an overview of his video to which the subsequent response will correspond. He begins by attempting to show how
6 studies which I found to be the most commonly cited and discussed around the matter
are either too erroneous, fraudulent, or don't actually show a high Ashkenazi IQ at all. As it turns out, not a single study says what he claims it does, and he either lies about them or simply doesn't know enough to properly understand them. And it's also not like these 6 studies he's chosen for us present the entire case for the high Ashkenazi IQ, as Ed Dutton has said about LAC's video.
No study is going to be perfect. You will be able to find problems with every study. But if you have lots and lots of studies that are pointing in the same direction, even though each of them has a problem, then you have what we call a cumulative case. And what the cumulative case indicates is that the average IQ of Ashkenazi Jews is somewhere in the region of 112. So that's the first problem with his argument.
He goes on to bring up his interpretations of the theories of how a high Ashkenazi IQ evolved in the first place. While LAC grossly misunderstands these theories, regardless, the explanations are always going to be secondary to the phenomenon itself, and we have plenty of evidence for that which we're going to lay out. Trying to debunk the individual theories people have had of gravity, for example, does nothing to stop things from falling to the ground, and it's the exact same thing here. And finally, he ends with a bunch of random points and scattered arguments, which he claims collectively debunk the high Ashkenazi IQ, as well as evidence commonly used to advance it. And this area is arguably where the most egregious mistakes are made, as we'll eventually see. So let's begin with the empirics he brings up in his own order. Backman, 1972. The results of this study confirm a very well-documented feature of the Ashkenazi intellectual profile: this curious disparity between visuospatial ability, which they tend to perform worse on, and other forms of intelligence, including verbal and mathematical abilities, which they usually excel at. He claims that because you can simply average all the subject scores included in the study together and get a marginally higher Ashkenazi IQ with respect to Gentile whites, this must mean that the advantage is simply too minor to be considered.
While this study may suggest a higher than average verbal IQ for Jews, it does nothing to suggest a higher general intelligence or a higher overall IQ score for Jews.
And note that he completely ignores the mathematical advantage of Ashkenazi Jews proven in the study. But if you take things a step further, you'll run into some problems with this conclusion. If we average the scores for the Asian students, we find that they perform just about the same as the Ashkenazi Jews, and according to his own logic, this should mean that there's really no mental advantage possessed by Asians either, it's simply too minor, although of course he doesn't actually believe this and in fact uses the well-documented high Asian IQ as an argument later in the video. Backman calls these scores collectively not IQ or general intelligence, but simply patterns of mental abilities. And this is noteworthy because the source of her data was not an IQ test, but actually a varied battery of orthogonal ability factors, including strange categories like hunting, fishing, color foods, etiquette, games, and screening. Since they were not designed with IQ in mind, simply averaging the scores on the subtests she selected and hoping for a figure comparable to other IQ scores is obviously problematic. First of all, it assumes that each is about equal in weight, or in more specific terms, that each has roughly an equal G loading, which is not at all the case here. Early on, Backman specifies that the test for verbal knowledge is VKN, on which Jews scored a mean of 57.1 compared to 51.9 for whites and 49 overall, is a general factor, and indeed verbal and the closely related reasoning subtests correlate most closely with the general factor of intelligence, to the point where psychometricians sometimes even make use of this by constructing their tests from verbal and reasoning items to the exclusion of the other types of items. This is not a fact LAC understands, or maybe is willing to accept. The theme throughout his video is that he boils down Ashkenazi intelligence to verbal ability alone.
Any reported high IQ of Jews is largely being bolstered by their standout performance in this one category of verbal IQ.
And proceeds to deride verbal ability as something trivial, casuistic.
Skills which involve solving real problems are unaffected by one's lexical acumen.
We'll come back to this point later on. Later in the video, when discussing Lynn 2003, LAC comes back to the Backman study to stress that, in fact, the white averages are weighed down by the possible inclusion of Hispanics. On screen, he writes that, quote, by 1970, Hispanics were already 19.9% of the population of New York City, as if New York is relevant in the slightest. This is a very petty objection given that Backman's data was drawn from the national student body, and that the American census for the year 1970 showed Hispanics comprised a whopping 4%, maybe around 5% of the white population, even assuming they were included, which in all likelihood is unspecified because it was simply too minor a concern. In fact, equally concerning could be the near-certain inclusion of Sephardic Jews in the Jewish white sample, given the fact that they comprised roughly an equal portion. But while we're airing objections, LAC doesn't mention the most obvious one for Backman 1972. The study controls for socioeconomic status by, quote, restricting the sample to the middle range of the SES scale, while simultaneously noting that, quote, the Jewish whites tended to be displaced toward the upper end of the SES scale. Because of the fact that IQ and SES correlate so highly, the exclusion of the upper tail places a much heavier downward pressure on the Jewish averages than any potential inclusion of Hispanics does for the white. So for Backman 1972, we find, even with the aforementioned bias against Jewish averages, a slightly higher than average pattern of mental ability, but a significantly higher Jewish general factor of intelligence. The study was not meant to and did not give us representative and comparable IQ scores, but it does not contradict the notion of a substantially higher Ashkenazi IQ, notwithstanding LAC's unfamiliarity with IQ testing and speculation about Hispanics. Levinson 1957. Ultimately, LAC misrepresents how Levinson's work is used. But the obvious must first be noted. Boris Levinson didn't author just this one 1957 study, so it's unclear why LAC presents it alone. When he's discussing Kevin MacDonald's book later on, he claims MacDonald cites one study by Levinson as
seemingly as the only source for his conclusion
that Ashkenazi Jews have a substantially higher than average IQ. Yet simply taking the time to read the references to Levinson on screen shows he doesn't even use the 1957 study once. So Levinson was a psychology professor at the primarily Jewish Yeshiva University in New York and conducted extensive research on the student body there, publishing 2 papers in 1957 and papers in 1958, 1959, 1960 on the topic of the performance of the Jewish children and adults alike. Assessing his line of research, it's true that it's generally not representative of the Jewish population at large vis-a-vis white Gentiles, because Levinson never really intended for it to be so. The major contribution of Levinson to this topic, rather, is his analysis of the peculiarities of Ashkenazi intelligence, namely this disparity between verbal, mathematical, and other forms of reasoning intelligence with visuospatial ability, also known as the performance IQ. And going back to the page taken from MacDonald, We can also see that it's not even using Levinson to prove a high Ashkenazi IQ as LAC claims, but rather examining these peculiarities. Levinson documents how the gap is barely present among Jewish children, but grows increasingly pronounced into adulthood, seriously suggesting a genetic basis if you're familiar with the Wilson effect. LAC goes on to reiterate his thoughts about Ashkenazi Jews effectively only being good talkers, but once again, Ashkenazi intelligence extends beyond purely verbal ability, although that itself is a very important factor in life outcomes and success. Lynn, 2003. Richard Lynn finds that American GSS data indicate an Ashkenazi IQ advantage of half a standard deviation, or 7.5 points. LAC doesn't have much of a basis to refute this, offering just two objections. Objection 1.
Note again that non-Jewish whites are grouped together, which means it is unclear again if this group includes people of Hispanic admixture.
Now, this is either just a flat-out lie or proof he didn't even bother to read the study himself. Lynn clarifies Hispanics are put in the other category, being excluded from non-Jewish whites. Richard Lynn, of all people, is fully aware of the average IQ differences between Hispanics and whites. Now, his second objection is, again, simply not understanding what has already been explained, and what Lynn is actually at great pains to clarify in his paper if he'd read it. Vocabulary is a good measure of both general intelligence and verbal intelligence, to quote Lynn. For instance, in the standardization sample of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the vocabulary subtest correlates 0.75 with the full-scale IQ, more highly than any other subtest, and the full-scale IQ is widely regarded as a good measure of general intelligence, or Spearman's G. We are therefore able to examine the vocabulary scores as a measure of the verbal and general intelligence of the four religious and ethnic groups. So LAC ignores all this, and weirdly enough, uses data not even from Lynn's analysis, but from Backman 1972, to again average out a mediocre IQ score. But all in all, Lynn 2003 confirms what we already know. Kevin MacDonald. LAC goes on to introduce basically a paragraph written by Kevin MacDonald, even though he hasn't actually done any original research on Ashkenazi intelligence. Instead, his works are sometimes used in explaining how the high Ashkenazi IQ came to be, not so much in proving its validity. But LAC makes it seem as though MacDonald has no idea what he's talking about when he does address his stuff, characterizing his emphasis on high Ashkenazi intelligence as premised solely on the Levinson study. Now, we've already seen how this paragraph LAC selects to represent the entirety of MacDonald's views on the matter doesn't actually address the extent of the Ashkenazi IQ, just its characteristics. You should ask yourself why it is that LAC doesn't ever give the page immediately prior, where MacDonald does address this very topic, and where Levinson isn't even brought up. On this page, he relates Louis Terman's classic 1926 study, which found twice as many gifted Jewish children than would be proportional. For his noted suggestion of an average IQ of 117 for Ashkenazi children, he references two additional studies, Backman 1970 and Vinson 1966, which we'll get to later. None of this is ever dealt with by LAC, so in the end what he does to dismiss MacDonald is simply give an unrelated portion and pretend it's all he has, apparently hoping viewers won't notice or haven't read the book. Regarding his earlier point about MacDonald's books and papers having a strong focus on the fact that Jewish overrepresentation cannot be explained by high IQ alone, referencing specifically the culture of critique and subsequent papers in his debate with Nathan Kaufness, this is about specifically Jewish behavior and intellectual trends in which Jewish merit does play an integral role. Anyway, there are very good reasons why the high Ashkenazi IQ is a central topic of the race realism debate, and why virtually all prominent hereditarians accept it as fact, including Kevin MacDonald, who is a serious believer in Jewish ethnocentrism and the so-called evolutionary strategy. Detractors are simply not serious in comparison, and in MacDonald's example, there is no reason why such notions can't be reconciled with a high Jewish IQ. Storfer, 1990. With Miles Storfer's book, which doesn't provide any original research but serves as an overview of sorts, LAC simply ignores everything that deals with the Ashkenazi IQ except for a few pages on kibbutzim, presents this as all Storfer has to offer. In other words, he does here exactly what he did with MacDonald. Why do you think that is? It's hard to see him doing something like this for any reason other than not being prepared to deal with what Storfer actually brings to the debate. Storfer's book is about the effects of various schemes on childhood intelligence, and the kibbutz pages come from the end of the chapter about successful early educational enrichment programs. It's frankly hard to assume LAC didn't see the entire chapter of the nurturing of verbal and conceptual reasoning abilities in Jewish families. The kibbutz portion is regarding extremely young subjects at a time when IQ is least heritable. It also notes that the scores are skewed upward a few points. The purpose of this section is not to give some shoddy estimates of Jewish superiority as LAC seems to think, but rather to analyze the effects of the kibbutz lifestyle on childhood intellect. And if we look at what LAC ignores, which is what people usually refer to with this book, it reviews a number of studies illustrating an overall high Ashkenazi IQ with a tilt away from visuospatial. Cicerelli 1976 and 78, Romanoff 1976, Letzer, Pfeiffer and Clark 1965, Adavai, Silverman, Magot 1970, Davies and Hughes 1927, Vincent 1966, and Marjoribanks 1972, of course none of which LAC touches. Herrnstein and Murray. It turns out LAC can't be fully honest about any of this. Ignoring the fact that even the page numbers cited in Storfer don't refer to the section on kibbutzim, which is all LAC has discussed, he mysteriously cuts off the important part of Herrnstein and Murray's writing on Ashkenazi Jewish intelligence. They go on to look at the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth data, showing that the Ashkenazi, quote, mean IQ was 0.97 standard deviation above the mean of the rest of the population and 0.84 standard deviation above the mean of whites who identify themselves as Christian, end quote. Although this sample may not have been fully representative. Richard Lynn, in his book on this topic, acknowledges this data too, which translates to an IQ of 112.6 relative to white Christians alone. So those are the only studies LAC gives. To recap, Backman 1972 shows a higher Ashkenazi general factor even in a biased sample, with a pattern of mental abilities comparable to Asians. Levinson's research extends far beyond 1957 and is used mainly for insights in the nature of Ashkenazi intelligence, not so much its extent. Lynn 2003 explicitly did not include Hispanics and shows a high Ashkenazi general intelligence, and for MacDonald, Storfer, and the bell curve, LAC omits very highly relevant portions of text in which they all provide fairly damning evidence that I've just reviewed. And regarding IQ studies, there's plenty more where that came from. Lynn and Kanazawa 2008, for example, found an even greater Ashkenazi IQ using the same method as Lynn 2003 and 4 times as large a sample size, this time an IQ of 109.25. Romanoff 1976, cited in both The Chosen People and Storfer 1990, found an average Otis IQ of 115 among over 700 Jewish public school students ages 12 to 18. Vincent 1966, described as one of the largest and best controlled studies of this type, found the average IQ of 708 Glasgow Jewish students aged 10 to 16 exclusive to be 117.8 relative to a 100 Gentile Glaswegian average. Richard Lynn notes that, based on his own independent research indicating a substantially depressed Scottish IQ, this score should be adjusted to a still significant mean of 111.5. Virtually all modern representative studies have shown the same results. Exceptions include some early 20th century testing, especially based on new Jewish immigrants with very little familiarity with the English language, which occasionally will show an average Jewish IQ, though rarely ever below that. All of this taken together should give you a pretty good picture of Ashkenazi intelligence. But the preceding is only just one type of evidence. If Ashkenazi Jews truly do have such an elevated intelligence, as is often said, the evidence for it should be bursting at the seams, and it is. So let's take a look at some examples. Jews are overrepresented in Mensa, which in the 90s revealed that 9% of its American members marked their religion as Judaism, although one could reasonably expect quite a few more to be included in the agnostic, atheist, and no-religion demographics, totaling 20% of members. Jews also have a historical record of being highly overrepresented in the scientific communities across the societies they inhabit, even in some anti-Semitic societies. In the late Soviet Union, for example, which went so far as to impose quotas against Jewish entry into higher education, Jews were by far the most represented per capita among Soviet scientists. Now, one of the most important pieces of evidence comes from the Ashkenazi genetic profile itself and recent methods of genetic analysis that have helped out tremendously with these questions. Handing it back to Ubersoy for this point.
Now, unfortunately, because our society is run by people who are high in equality moral foundations, there are only a few studies which have established a clear genetic group boundaries in intelligence. But this study from Curtis Dunkill et al., albeit with a small Jewish sample that also focuses on religious Jews as opposed to secular ones, has confirmed what we knew before on the genetic level. Also, notice that the tilt on educational attainment is much bigger than their tilt on IQ, despite the fact that both constructs correlate rather well with each other. This validates my hypothesis of them being higher on the general factor of personality, contributing further to their overrepresentation that I will explain later. Getting an education is not only about your IQ, it is also about your personality, which correlates with it at around 0.4. If that wasn't the case, then the traits that combine the GFP wouldn't correlate with it, but they do, and we know the genes that are responsible for it. I wish I could say more, but there's not enough of genetic data at the moment. However, knowing the heritability of intelligence across and within groups to be at least 70% genetic, it is enough to establish a genetic link. The other line of evidence comes in the form of Ashkenazi Jews having atypical personalities and brain structures. Now, I have my own specific theory on that which I will not dwell upon in this video, but I want you to consider this line of evidence. The percentage of Israeli Jews with high-functioning autism is more than 10 times higher than their Arab counterparts, while the prevalence of autism is about 6 times greater among Israeli Jews than amongst Arabs. This illustrates a specific form of selection that is tilted towards autistic traits that are known to have a strong genetic correlation with intelligence, but not quite as much with educational attainment, and yes, only for high-functioning autists. Now, I wish there were more studies like this, and not just about Jews, but unfortunately our leftist regime does everything possible to suppress this type of research, and I cover it in my previous video that you should definitely check out.
LAC has quite a lot to say about the Nobel Prize, being one of the most common and almost normish talking points, but in fairness offering a very obvious counter to his claims. In explaining the wildly disproportionate Jewish share of Nobel Prize recipients, LAC claims this is in large part due to a, quote, well-known Jewish bias. But what bias? If one has been speculated to exist, it certainly isn't well known. It's true that the Nobel is awarded on the deliberation of a committee, but these committees are predominantly Swedish, not Jewish. Take the Physics Nobel, for example, which is granted by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences on the basis of finalized nominations from the Nobel Committee for Physics. It's not at all Jew-dominated, or whatever, their members are all available. He then claims that because of the Ashkenazi verbal ability, which he initially described as slightly better than average and now sees that they score exceptionally well in the verbal portion of IQ tests, they're able to, quote, sway a few votes their way. Ignoring the fact that this is just not at all how the selection process works, it isn't just a bunch of scientists trying to persuade a selection committee to choose them, and it's entirely behind closed doors. He goes on to concede that this is nowhere near adequate in explaining the extent of Jewish overrepresentation among Nobel Prize recipients, which I suspect he's still chalking up to some sort of racist bias. But again, what bias? Has such a bias existed since the beginning, when Jewish German scientists were already dominating the German Nobel while just being around 1% of the broader population? Well, perhaps there's a way to test whether such a bias likely exists. We have two scenarios, one where the Nobel is and apparently always has been biased in the favor of Jews, and another where Jews simply have proven disproportionately competent in these areas. In a way, this example is a microcosm for the entire video. In the second, the competency hypothesis, we would expect to see this trend mimicked in virtually all other accolades for which Jews are equally eligible, and we would also expect to see it mirror the Jewish IQ tilt discussed earlier. Because Jews score higher in verbal and mathematical areas and lesser in visuospatial ability, then we would expect to see the Jewish share of these respective areas to match, although Jews would likely be disproportionate in all of them given the fact that there are other factors aside from IQ which contribute to Jewish success. This will be discussed later. And, maybe shockingly, maybe not, this is exactly what's found. Prizes for mathematics, physics, chemistry, computer science, and the likes tend to be around 20 to 50% Jewish, while top prizes in engineering and architecture seem to be around 10 to 15% Jewish. Assuming LAC's conclusions are true, it's genuinely impressive that Jews have managed to project some sort of extreme Jewish bias on virtually all relevant prizes, not just the Nobel. It's also very strange that this doesn't hold true in prizes for visuospatial ability, where I don't think there's reason to assume the dazzling verbal abilities of Ashkenazi Jews would suddenly be rendered useless. But of course, the Nobel Prize is no perfect proxy for IQ, and there are other factors involved. Developed countries, obviously, and the populations within them more specifically, tend to have far higher chances of creating the innovations awarded by such prizes in the first place. But that's just one factor, and within these developed countries, Jews clearly outperform. But his idea that, quote, there's not even any reason to believe that a higher IQ correlates with receiving more Nobel Prizes, isn't even what the paper he cites maintains, even in the abstract he's putting on screen. It is found that both IQ scores and Q-index contribute significantly to the number of per capita Nobel Prizes. This is the point. What we would expect with a high Ashkenazi IQ is exactly what we see. If the totality of prizes in these fields can be seen as nothing else than a strong indication as to who comprises the intellectual leaders of these fields, then it's abundantly clear where Jews stand. But if instead LAC wishes to assign all of this to some sort of post hoc explanation of nepotism, foul play, collusion, without any proof whatsoever, by the way, then it's more than obvious how ideologically driven and ultimately unserious he is. Do keep in mind that LAC only got started on this after parading around the notable disproportion of Jewish guests on the JRE podcast. To this day, he hasn't actually clarified exactly what collusion means in this context or how he thinks it might work. The only thing close to it that he's offered is the claim that Joe Rogan's wife and Booker are Jewish, but as I point out in my response, he doesn't present any evidence for this, and regardless, Joe Rogan is the one who decides whom he interviews. So how can collusion be responsible for this outcome, exaggerated as it may be? All he has here, ultimately, is an instance of Jewish overrepresentation, and he goes on to assume that that's enough evidence needed to conclude the existence of some insidious Jewish forces working behind the scenes. Or take chess. LAC devotes an entire chapter of his video dismissing the notion that since Jews are overwhelmingly represented among the greatest chess players, this might suggest something, anything about their intelligence. But note how the bigger point goes over LAC's head. If instead of Jews being almost half of chess grandmasters, it was Wall Street executives, or for the matter, guests on the Joe Rogan Experience, he would pass this off as obvious evidence of ethnic nepotism ipso facto. But, and ironically as with the JRE, since there's no real possibility of nepotism explaining to any significant extent the high Jewish achievement in chess, in which success is determined as objectively as can be, not by committee or anything, he simply ignores it and its serious implications for the rest of his beliefs. Another noteworthy example could be the card game bridge. Richard Lynn notes that in 2004, 55 of the 156 top-rated bridge players among the Open World Champions have been American, and 18 of these 55 are Jews, or 33%, with similarly high proportions in other countries like Britain and France. So I just gave you 3 instances which decisively demonstrate that substantial Jewish overrepresentation can and does occur without collusion, meaning you need actual positive evidence and can't just assume that to be the cause for every example of Jewish overrepresentation. And one more point needs to be addressed. Although LAC presents the Ashkenazi IQ as, quote, the last standing defense against accusations of overrepresentation, there are actually multiple converging factors that are conducive to success, prominence, influence, which work in synergy to overwhelmingly explain Jewish overrepresentation as a phenomenon. The geographic distribution of American Jews is a factor that constantly escapes mention in these discussions. Regardless, location is crucial. You can have 2 populations with identical IQ distributions, but if population A is primarily located in small towns in the countryside, while population B is in influential cities, it's obvious which is going to have more opportunities to express its potential, and thus which will succeed over the other, independent of IQ, because mental potential is just one form. This is roughly the case with whites and Jews, the former being more rural and the latter being an urban population, to be expected with the founding stock of a country versus more recent arrivals. So while you'd expect a large number of naturally born white Gentile geniuses based on the size of the American white population, far more are located away from the universities and other sources of success provided by cities that Jews typically have access to. And the advantage doesn't just rest with the fact that Jews are urban, too. The plurality of Jews are located in the northeastern United States specifically, owing to their immigration patterns. A quarter of American Jews still live in New York City, where in turn they comprise 13% of the overall population. The areas in which Jews live tend to be particularly influential and provide a number of opportunities for Jewish children. For example, many national companies are based in and naturally hire largely from New York City, the country's finance and media capital. In terms of population numbers alone, then, one would expect Jews to be disproportionately represented in these companies on the basis of nothing else, at least when compared with the national Jewish proportion. Jews are also the most well-educated group, which could be due to a number of factors like urbanness and wealth, but perhaps along with the long-documented cultural emphasis on education, similar to that of Asian families. The Jewish geographic distribution also coincides with the Ivy League, which, along with the many times overrepresentation in national merit scholarships and other forms of academic achievement, guarantees a significant portion of the Ivy League student body is Jewish, although this has been decreasing in recent years. While, starting with Ron Unz, this phenomenon has been dismissed as purely the result of nepotism and laxism in the administrations, an emotion not dissimilar to LAC's, the math simply doesn't work out when accounting for the right factors. This isn't to mention how there is the same if not a greater trend in the first half of the 20th century before Jews were even allowed in the Ivy League administrations, and to the point where these universities imposed anti-Jewish quotas to keep the tide down. The trend was also there in many other European countries throughout history, really. But regardless, the Ivy League is a de facto gateway into the American elite, and Jewish Americans have the right combination of goods for this path. The general factor of personality is likely another factor in the overrepresentation of Ashkenazi Jews. While it's not necessarily related to sheer competency, it's also not going to be the result of nepotism. Handing it back to Ubersoy.
The other explanation that I believe should be more discussed is that Ashkenazi Jews not only happen to be high IQ, well-educated, wealthy, and live in major cities, but they also happen to be higher on the variable known as the general factor of personality. In fact, the personality differences between religious Jews and religious Christians are about the same, if not greater, than their IQ differences. What is the general factor of personality, you ask? Well, just like there is a general factor of intelligence, the general subsets of the Big Five correlate with each other into producing a prosocial general factor of personality. Those with the low score have difficulties in life, while those who happen to be high score tend to be very successful with people. Much like the general factor of intelligence correlates with various things in life, the second place is not given to socioeconomic status or parental income or even the type of culture one carries. The solid second place is the general factor of personality, as its prosocial correlates are quite high in comparison to the other variables. And furthermore, it is less of a proxy for intelligence like other variables, as it correlates with G at only 0.11. The correlation between GFP and work performance is at 0.31. The correlation between GFP and team emergence is at 0.44. And now watch this. The correlation between GFP and leadership emergence is 0.49. That is to say, those who are more on the slow life history distribution would have a much higher GFP score than those who are more R-selected. For instance, in a sample that excluded secular Jews, religious Jews were found to have an IQ that is less of atheists, yet unlike atheists, they were proven to have a strong correlation with GFP to a point of having differences of more than one standard deviation on the variables of social sensitivity, culture, self-confidence, leadership, and mature personality than their atheist or religious Gentile counterparts. You probably know a person who scored like 92 on an IQ test but is very pro-social and generally good to be around. Well, it is almost certain that this person is high on the general factor of personality, which somewhat compensates for his below-average IQ. And Ashkenazi Jews were lucky enough to be born with both. I would argue that the contribution of general factor of personality in explaining the overrepresentation of Ashkenazi Jews in social leadership positions, such as politics for example, is about as important, if not more so important than IQ. Now I'm passing the torch back to Will.
As we can easily see, the reality is a lot more complex than LAC lets on, and no one is relying on some 200 Ashkenazi IQ explanation to explain all of Jewish success in every single instance every single time. Nor are we denying that ethnic nepotism exists among Jews. It obviously exists by the simple fact that it exists for all groups of people with self-identity. A group of people defined and perpetuated by the desire of its members to identify with it is going to inspire some form of in-group bias. The question, rather, is one of extent. In effect, it's actually LAC and people like him who rely on this one ready-made answer as the explanation for most Jewish overrepresentation, portraying Jewish ethnocentrism to a nearly impossible degree and one certainly not in accordance with other related signs. Intermarriage, famously, is one of those signs, and to a degree can function as a proxy for ethnocentrism, although the full picture is obviously a bit more complicated than that. Highly ethnocentric groups generally have steadily low rates of intermarriage because they find members of their own group to be more appealing, and they want their children to be raised with a firm heritage and identity, and perhaps find those outside the group to be inherently undesirable. The opposite is true for groups with low ethnocentrism. They have lower group cohesion and self-identification, and as such they're far more willing to marry outside the group. For married Jews, the total intermarriage rate is nearly half, and among the most recent marriage cohort, it's around 61%. Of course, the fact that Jews are an ethno-religious group and not simply an ethnic group complicates the data, since strictly religious Jews aren't allowed to marry non-Jews. Their tendency to adhere to this reflects more than just an ethnic bias. If we look at Jews of no religion, theoretically bound solely by such a bias, 79% are married to non-Jews. Though even among strictly religious Jews, religious intermarriage is relatively high. Moving on, let's go over the other scattered arguments he makes in the final part of his video. He brings up Episcopalians and tries to show that since they allegedly have a higher IQ and number about a fifth of the Jewish population, they should make up about a fifth or more of Joe Rogan's political guests on his podcast.
We would expect Episcopalians to represent about a fifth or more of Joe Rogan's political guests on his podcast. But of course, the reality is nowhere near that.
If I'm being brutally honest, this is his most impressively asinine point by a wide margin. Most obviously, it assumes that Jews make up 100% of Joe Rogan's political guests. It's doubtful whether they make up even 42% of political guests, as he says, but assuming that's true and that IQ is the only factor in your probability to go on Joe's show, then the actual figure would be around 8% or more of guests. Maybe LAC can check the numbers here. Secondly, Episcopalians have actually comprised a starkly disproportionate share of the American elite since the early days, and this is something he doesn't mention.
Along with Ashkenazi Jews and Hindus, Episcopalians happen to be top earners in the US, and furthermore, despite Episcopalians being about 1% of the US population, they happen to occupy about 5% of Congress. Jews, for instance, make up 2.5% of the population, but control just 6.5% of the Congress. In addition to that, a whole 11 presidents were Episcopalians, but none were Jewish. And that's by no means a coincidence. America was founded as an Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, and much of its elite was comprised of that. But unfortunately, what many Anglo-Saxon Protestants of today forget to mention is that its Protestantism was rather liberal and Episcopalian. Indeed, conservative Protestants made about 10% of the entire American elite, while the rest was split between moderate and liberal Protestants, with a heavier emphasis on the liberal Protestants. For more on that, you can read Eric Kaufman's The Rise and Fall of White Anglo-America, and also the survey of the elites that I'm referencing for the purpose of this video. A few percentage of the Episcopalian combined with liberal Protestants made just about 10% of the entire American population, yet comprised about half of the American elite overall, before being replaced by other liberal-leaning elites such as Ashkenazi Jews and other white ethnics. Interestingly enough, although at that time Episcopalians ratioed Jews on business, even back then the Jews have ratioed the Episcopalians on the intellectual elite, before being ratioed themselves by Unitarian Universalists. Another paper puts Episcopalians in control of 1 in 3 major banks in the early 1980s and about 20% of the major businesses before they were reduced to a minuscule 6% of the Congress. At the end of the video, I make the argument that the same fate awaits Jews. And why are we not aware of this, are you asking? Well, they aren't, as they say, racialized. Episcopalian identity is not as salient as Jewish identity is, even though it is significantly more leftist in behavior, yet their overrepresentation was and still to some extent accounted by the same demographic variables that Jews possess: high intelligence, urbanization, high general factor of personality, and other things. Similarly, we see the same overrepresentation among other minority groups such as Indians, who are just 1.4% of the population but comprise about 25% of the startups in the Silicon Valley, in terms of other things. Now, isn't it unusual that a small minority group, which is disproportionately liberal even by 2014 standards, and who is as lefty partisan as Reformed Judaism, controlling so much power? Had he actually done his research, he wouldn't take such a big L.
Thirdly, he somehow doesn't notice that this novel data that he's bringing to the table contradicts everything else that he's been saying this entire time. In the same graph that he puts on screen, it shows that Jews score an IQ of 112 and rank toward the top of the list. I mean, this is just entirely self-refuting. But fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, LAC once again didn't read the study that he's citing. Just a few minutes earlier, in the video chapter How IQ Works, he argues that because IQ is artificially mapped onto a normal distribution, true, we should therefore take any claims of a high Ashkenazi IQ with a grain of salt. Even if they're true, the smart fraction could still be lower for Jews. He doesn't actually present any evidence for how this would call into question Ashkenazi intelligence, but he does say that, quote, at least among whites, general intelligence has a significantly longer right tail than left tail, or as he claims, is a skewed right distribution. For his observation to advance his overall argument, however, the Ashkenazi distribution would have to be shown to be skewed even further to the right, concentrating Ashkenazi Jews in the lower range while bringing up the mean past that of whites. But according to his own research that he brings up, that's the opposite of the case, and the high IQ fraction among Ashkenazi Jews is larger than that of any other tested demographic, 4 percentage points above even Episcopalians. This fact, combined with sheer numbers and the other factors dealt with above, means there's really no competition between Episcopalians and Jews, despite what LAC tries to argue. A significant high IQ fraction among Jews has also been seen time and time again in other research, including the Terman study MacDonald mentioned in A People That Shall Dwell Alone, dealt with earlier, or an independent study in New York of 28 children who'd scored above 170 on the Stanford Binet, 23 of whom were Jewish. And as one final note on the Episcopalian question, we're ignoring the fact that Episcopalianism is strictly a religion, a sect that many liberal Christians convert to, and thus is subject to selection biases that Jews, as primarily an ethnic group, are not. And it only gets worse from here. Next up is his argument that white Americans actually have a mean IQ of 104, meaning that the gap between whites and Ashkenazi Jews is automatically lesser, or perhaps non-existent, or maybe even negative. I'm not really sure what he thinks at this point. The problem with this is that IQ, as he seems to already be aware, is a relative measure with no units of its own. You cannot assign someone or a population of people an IQ without it being relative to some other entity. With individual IQ tests, this usually means your IQ is being compared on a normal distribution of the estimated overall population with a default mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So even though LAC's own citation from the bell curve doesn't show an average white American IQ of 104, but of 103, and earlier actually of 101 to 102, his dishonesty here doesn't even really matter. Studies that assess the Ashkenazi IQ, including the ones that we've reviewed, hold the white mean intentionally at 100, and that's how the gap is determined in the first place. Next up is his bizarre, crude argument that because Ashkenazi Jews descend from Levantine and European populations, they cannot have an average IQ as high as commonly quoted because it's so heritable. This completely rules out the possibility of it evolving, which is the entire point of this discussion, basically. Ubersoy will be explaining later on how the Ashkenazi IQ developed in the first place, but ultimately we've already demonstrated it very clearly. This is a fact that LAC simply must accept, and any speculation as to how it came to be is irrelevant to the fact itself. However, I hope the audience is able to tell how this particular instance of speculation is pretty ridiculous. And finally, we get to the extremely common argument among those who struggle with the facts of Ashkenazi intelligence, perhaps similarly to how many blacks may struggle with the facts of European intelligence.
Even if they excel in linguistics, I put it to you that this is largely useless in terms of real problem solving. Engineering, physics, the building of modern civilization, skills which involve solving real problems are unaffected by one's lexical acumen. Their IQ scores, mediocre though they are are only being bolstered by a domain which we ought not to value as highly as others.
Right, so we return to the serious ignorance and familiarity with this subject that we discussed with Backman 1972 and in other places in this video. One's verbal IQ is not just linguistics or lexical acumen at all. As Storfer 1990 writes, the Jewish intellect appears to be centered on an ability to manipulate and integrate chains of reasoning, especially those related to causality, coupled with a faculty otherwise known as verbal and or symbolic analytics to interrelate and explain derived meanings. Psychometricians don't just rely so much on verbal subtests to see how well their subjects can woo and deceive them. And yes, once again we see that LAC is forgetting his own Backman 1972, which proved a high Ashkenazi mathematical IQ as well. And this is how he's able to include physics with engineering, even though we've already seen how much Jews excel in that field, a very mathematical subject as it is. Now, once again, it's true that this comes at the exclusion of the performance IQ, or in other words, that Jews aren't intellectually advanced all around, but who cares? The point of this video is to address the underlying causes of Jewish success, something which will more often than not require advanced verbal ability, and the best LSE can do is claim that because there's a deficiency in this other area, then Jews can't create civilization or something. This comment comes off as nothing but resentful, and more importantly, besides the point. You don't need to be an architect to find success, or to go on the JRE for that matter.
And he then talks about, oh, well, why aren't Episcopalians overrepresented in the same way on the Joe Rogan show? Well, then there's other things you can look into. When you're being interviewed on a show, you'll know this from experience of my own show, that I'll get these people on and they're extremely clever or whatever, but they can't, they're not verbally skilled, or that they're not particularly eloquent, put it like that. So and they're no good as a guest, and then people don't watch and they get bored and all this sort of thing. So I think that, but obviously Jewish people are extremely verbally skilled, so that you can see that they would be overrepresented in that way as well, eloquent.
The Ashkenazi IQ is again an accepted truth among hereditarians. It should not be believed so easily as LAC does that they're all simply wrong. There are, however, important reasons why people on the right who otherwise recognize racial differences might want to twist themselves into a pretzel in order to deny this specific one. If you can deny any significantly raised intelligence to Jews, you can then focus all your efforts on dismissing their achievements as purely the result of a unique hyper-ethnocentrism and ethnic nepotism. And it also gets rid of the uncomfortable obligation to concede one positive trait to your chosen enemy. Let's move on to this final counter-argument, the Israeli IQ. LAC performs a crude calculation with a lot of guesswork to get an average Israeli Ashkenazi IQ of 103. He assumes this exact demographic breakdown. And he claims he brought down the Arab IQ to 80 for good measure, but that calculation returns a national IQ of 93, not 94. He doesn't even explain why he estimates the others to equally average 94, which is odd when you consider that other Jews would include the lowest scorers, Ethiopian Jews. More accurate estimates were probably given in Richard Lynn's book. Lynn was also the source of LAC's Israeli data taken from world data. The study that LAC cites also comes from Lynn, and LAC even uses Lynn's book where these calculations I'm about to get to are made in this video, so it's unclear why he's ignoring them. From Lynn's assembled data, he estimates the Israeli national IQ to be 95, which balances an average Arab IQ of 84, Oriental Jewish IQ of 91, and European Jewish IQ of 106, but he goes on to claim that European Jews, who comprise half of Israel's Jewish population, are also not fully Ashkenazi, but include Sephardic Jews and non-Jewish Slavs who immigrated to Israel from the USSR, to find an average Israeli Ashkenazi IQ of 110. Let's briefly come back to review these claims. The video is premised on the idea that IQ is the last standing defense against accusations of overrepresentation, when Jewish overrepresentation occurs even when ethnic nepotism is precluded, as in Chess and Bridge, and is the result of a number of factors including geographic distribution and the general factor of personality. The video is also premised on the repeated notion that Jews only score well in the verbal portion of IQ tests, which LAC claims is nothing more than linguistics and lexical acumen, both claims being dead wrong, of course. Contra LAC, Backman and Lynn, along with a number of unmentioned studies, confirm a very high average Ashkenazi IQ, while Levinson's works aren't intended to. He also omits the most relevant portions of MacDonald, Storfer, and Herrnstein Murray for some reason, which confirm what we already know. His claim that the disproportionate Jewish share of Nobel recipients is caused by a well-known Jewish bias is unsubstantiated, and ignores that Jews perform similarly in other intellectual and academic awards. He claims Episcopalians should make up 20% of Joe Rogan Experience political guests, although in reality the expected proportion going by IQ alone is 8%. He also claims that Episcopalians should be more disproportionately represented than Ashkenazi Jews, although his own data not only proves a very high mean Ashkenazi IQ, but also that they have a larger smart fraction than Episcopalians by far. All of this, by the way, forms a cumulative case for higher Ashkenazi intelligence. All of it needs to be taken together to get the full picture, and when you honestly do so, there's really no way of confronting this fact. He claims that whites have an IQ of 104, which isn't true according to his own source, but ignores the relative nature of IQ. Finally, he claims that the Israeli Ashkenazi IQ scores debunk the notion, but relies on inadequate numbers to do so. This video has also laid out plenty of strong converging lines of evidence in favor of the Jewish competency hypothesis. To clarify once more, this theory is not premised on there being no major instances or habits of ethnic nepotism in the Jewish community. Rather, and as opposed to LAC, it posits that the primary cause of Jewish success and overrepresentation is based on their merit. In other words, to understand why Jews are so disproportionately prominent, you must first understand that they're also disproportionately competent. There are two more topics this video has not yet covered. The first is addressed in the second to last chapter, even if the claims are true. In this section, LAC addresses the effects of Jewish overrepresentation. He says that even if the competency hypothesis is true, this state of affairs is wholly unacceptable. Now, far more than the rest of his video, this point contains some genuine truth, but it requires some broader context. It's very important to demarcate discussion of the causes of Jewish overrepresentation with discussion of the ultimate effects of it on the broader non-Jewish society. The purpose of this exchange has been to discuss the former, while the latter would likely take a whole video of its own. This second point, not yet covered, is addressed in the middle of LAC's video, where he attempts to debunk the individual explanations that have arisen to explain the development of the high Ashkenazi IQ. As I've emphasized since the beginning, the explanations of the fact are secondary to the fact itself, and you can't debunk the latter by poking holes in the former. But it's an important point regardless.
Now, let's talk about the model. How did that happen? In the book, The 10,000-Year Explosion by Gregory Cochrane and Henry Harpending, the final chapter covers a model by which Ashkenazi Jews got to their level of intelligence. It proposed several hypotheses that worked in combination to achieve this result. I will simply reiterate his main points here because I think that overall it's a pretty good model. The first line of evidence comes from the fact that intelligence is heritable, just like all traits, and although the model proposes it being 30% heritable, which is ridiculous as intelligence is known to be at least 70% heritable, but even with a 30% hereditary estimate, this model seems to work. And why does it work? Well, Jews were essentially forbidden to own land, and consequently, because of their high literacy, they began working in trade and other G-loaded professions. When anti-Semitism increased, they further specialized in high-skilled professions such as trade and finance, which requires high general factor of intelligence and of personality. To quote a passage from the book, of the 228 adult male Jews mentioned in the registers, almost 80% appear as lenders to their Christian neighbors. Moreover, the Jews more active as moneylenders appear to have been the most respected members of the community. In Poland, about 15% of the Jewish population were earners of wages, salaries, and fees. The rest were independent owners of business enterprises. When modernity finally approached, about 90% of Poles were farmers, while the great majority of Jews occupied positions of the managerial elite. Obviously, you need to have a very high IQ to sustain this. Finally, what's most important for a model, successful Jews enjoyed significant reproductive success, while Jews who weren't as successful did not. That's the eugenics effect, not whatever LAC thinks it is. For instance, the proportion of Jews that lived in the Islamic world tended to occupy low IQ occupations and consequently weren't selected for intelligence to the same extent as Ashkenazi Jews have. They weren't part of the intellectual class. However, here's something cool. In part, this was because other minority groups, notably Greek Christians, Armenians, and so on, competed successfully for these jobs, and in part it was because Muslims, valuing non-warrior occupations more highly than medieval Christians did, took many of those jobs themselves. The Jews were simply outcompeted there. But if that was not the case, then we would not only have Ashkenazi Jewish overrepresentation, but also Sephardic and Mizrahi overrepresentation. High-skilled professions among fellow Christians were stigmatized, being labeled as dirty, greedy, and a ton of other things. So they assured it to the Jews, who they thought were so inferior to them that they should entertain themselves with inferior matters such as trade and finance. Furthermore, the spiteful anger which had accompanied the pogroms typically resulted in poor Jews being targeted the most, while rich Jews escaped and passed on their genes. That is to say, anti-Semitism caused a very strong selection to emerge in combination with Jewish G-loaded professional practices and resulted in the proliferation of the genes who were most successful at both adapting to harsh environments and successfully competing in the market. Now, if you want to deny this, if you want to claim that what I have just said is pseudoscience, and to be frank, most of the uneducated public would, you would also have to deny that human traits are heritable, and you would also have to deny that there is such a thing as intergenerational change known as evolution, and you'd also have to deny that selective pressures determine the direction of the intergenerational change, and that these selective pressures ultimately resulted in Jews being forced to do high IQ professions by their Gentile counterparts. Now, LAC and many others are right to be concerned about the disproportionate Jewish influence or the influence of any other minority group, especially if their vote overwhelmingly goes to one party, or even if their influence goes against the interests of the majority of people. Now this is ultimately his argument here, that he hid behind a 30-minute video of a massive Dunning-Kruger effect of speaking about the topic he very evidently knows so little of. I will definitely address this question in another video if this one gets enough of attention. I will also be happy to debate LAC on this point in particular if he concedes that he was wrong on the IQ part, and if he doesn't, I'm also happy to debate him on the IQ part. But let me not leave you without nothing. This is not a stable number we're discussing here. This overrepresentation is not going to be here forever. Quite to the contrary, it was selected under the conditions shaped by strong anti-Semitism, but now, when these pressures are relaxed, Jewish elite overrepresentation declines, and the biggest contributing factor to that decline is assimilation. For instance, 72% of all non-Orthodox Jews are in a mixed marriage whose children will grow up to not identify as Jewish in most cases and will also have an IQ score similar to their parents' ethnic group. If you look at Biden's cabinet, a majority of influential Jews there have married Gentiles. The effects of that could also be observed in a significant decline of the Jewish share among elite institutions. Among the American elite academics, just 4% of millennials are Jewish by their faith, while about 21% of boomers are. Now, the actual number of Ashkenazi Jews is probably closer to 10%, or is at least 10% among millennial elites, given the ones with the higher IQ tend to be secular, but there certainly is a trend you can't deny here. Another way you can observe this is among the leftist cultural elite, which traditionally was heavily influenced by Jews. But today, BreadTube, the largest decentralized leftist cultural elite group at least on the internet, is overwhelmingly led by Gentiles. The only one who is Jewish out of the major BreadTubers is this idiot, and frankly I believe he married a Gentile woman. But other than that, it's totally run by white shitlibs. The only Jews who reproduce and not intermarry happen to be Orthodox Jews who happen to overwhelmingly vote Republican and also have a lower average IQ than secular Jews. That is to say, Jews are a very heterogeneous group, whereas 29% of all Jews happen to be conservative. Among Orthodox Jews, who have the most children, 3/4 happen to be Republican. If we compare them to other groups such as Hindus or Episcopalians, who both happen to be influential and have higher IQs in America, then Jews appear at least twice as conservative as both of these groups. However, if you go to another country like Canada, where I live, then the Orthodox share of the population is greater than it is in the US, and consequently the number of conservative-leaning Jews approaches half of the total. And finally, despite Kevin MacDonald's prediction in his second book, secular Ashkenazi Jews assimilate and will continue to unless they are stopped by anti-Semites. In fact, the people making this video, myself and Will Viver, are a product of this assimilation. He is half Jewish and I am a third Jewish, but if the selective pressures in the form of anti-Semitism were high, then none of our ancestors would have intermarried with Gentiles, and there is a high chance that I would have grown up to be a breadtuber. So, to look at this pragmatically, the future of Jews in the West is to end up like me in one generation. And the ones who would not end up like me would end up even more right-winged than me. Either way, if you like freedom and meritocracy, but you are concerned about the Jewish overrepresentation on the left or even in general, then this scenario looks like the best outcome for you. The problem will solve itself. The only thing you should do is to treat Jews as you would treat Gentiles.